The void of space stretched endlessly before the fleet, a canvas of black pierced by pinpricks of light. Stars shimmered like distant promises, their cold glow offering no warmth to those who dared traverse the darkness. The United Systems Alliance's 7th Expeditionary Fleet drifted in formation, its ships sleek and angular against the infinite expanse. Each vessel was a marvel of human ingenuity, a testament to centuries of technological advancement. But here, at the edge of known space, they felt small, fragile even. Captain Elara Voss stood on the bridge of her flagship, Eos Dawn, staring out at the crimson orb that loomed ahead, Kaelis, the blood moon. Its surface pulsed faintly, as though it were alive, breathing in slow, deliberate rhythms. The moon had been a legend among spacers for generations, a cursed place where ships vanished without a trace. To some it was superstition, to others prophecy. But now, staring into its eerie red glow, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them. Her hands tightened around the railing as memories surfaced unbidden. She remembered the faces of her last crew, lost during a failed mission. Years ago, they had trusted her, followed her orders, and she had led them straight into disaster. Redemption wasn't something she sought often. It was more of a quiet ache, buried deep beneath layers of duty and discipline. But this mission felt different. If there was any truth to the stories about Kaelis, then humanity needed answers, and if anyone could find them, it would be her. Behind her, the hum of activity filled the air. Officers moved between stations, their boots clicking softly against the metal floor. Holographic displays flickered with streams of data, mapping trajectories and analyzing energy signatures emanating from the moon. The tension was palpable, a low-grade anxiety simmering just below the surface. No one spoke of the rumors openly, but everyone knew why they were here. Commander Rhea Solis approached, her sharp features illuminated by the soft blue glow of her datapad. "We're within range, Captain," she said, her voice clipped. "Initial scans confirm unusual energy patterns consistent with gravitational anomalies." Elara nodded, her gaze never leaving the viewport. "Anything else?" Rhea hesitated, glancing at the screen again. "There's interference. Something's disrupting our systems. It's not natural." "Define not natural," Elara replied, turning to face her second-in-command. "I mean, it's intelligent." Rhea's tone carried an edge of frustration. "Whatever we're dealing with isn't random cosmic phenomena. This thing knows we're here." The weight of her words settled over the room like a shroud. Intelligent, the word hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Humanity had encountered alien life before, but nothing like this. Nothing so vast, so ancient, so utterly incomprehensible. Elara turned back to the viewport, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to take her people and run while they still could. But running wouldn't solve anything. If Kaelis truly was intelligent and hostile, then fleeing would only delay the inevitable. Someone had to face it. Someone had to understand. Before she could give the order to proceed cautiously, alarms blared throughout the ship. Red warning lights flashed, bathing the bridge in an ominous glow. One of the officers shouted, "Gravitational pull increasing!" "We're being dragged closer." Elara's heart pounded as she gripped the railing tighter. Outside the viewport, the crimson moon seemed to swell, growing larger with each passing second. Her stomach churned as the ship lurched violently, throwing several crew members off balance. Panic rippled through the ranks, but Elara forced herself to remain calm. Losing control now would mean losing everything. Divert all available power to engines. She barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Engage counter-thrusters at maximum output." The crew scrambled to comply, fingers flying over consoles as the ship groaned under the strain. For a moment, it seemed to work. The fleet stabilized, holding steady against the moon's relentless pull. But then another alarm sounded, this one deeper, more guttural. A new message appeared on the main display, written in characters none of them recognized. "What is that?" someone whispered, their voice trembling. "It's a transmission," Dr. Idris Khan called out from his station. He was already working furiously, feeding the data into the ship's translation matrix. Seconds later, the AI delivered its verdict: "The blood moon hungers." A collective shiver ran through the bridge. Hunger. The word conjured images of predators stalking prey, of insatiable appetites that could never be sated. Whatever Kaelis was, it wasn't content to let them leave peacefully. It wanted something, and it intended to take it. Elara clenched her jaw, her mind racing. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt. She had to act. Fast. "Status report," she demanded, her voice cutting through the rising tide of panic. "All ships are experiencing similar effects," Rhea replied, her eyes scanning her datapad. "Life support systems destabilizing, reactor cores overheating. We've got maybe 20 minutes before." Before what? Before they became sacrifices to the blood moon, before they joined the countless others who had disappeared here. Elara didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. She made her decision. "Prepare emergency protocols," she ordered. "Evacuate non-essential personnel to escape pods. Arm all defensive systems. And someone get me a damn explanation for what the hell we're dealing with." As the crew sprang into action, Elara allowed herself a single fleeting glance at the moon. Its crimson glow seemed almost mocking now, taunting her with its secrets. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain. Humanity's survival depended on unraveling the mystery of Kaelis, and Elara Voss wasn't about to let fear stand in her way. The transmission repeated itself, a haunting mantra that echoed through the ship's comms system. "The blood moon hungers." Each word was delivered in a toneless, mechanical voice, devoid of emotion, yet heavy with implication. The crew froze, their movements stilled by the weight of those 5 simple words. Hunger. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration, a demand, and it left no room for negotiation. Elara's mind raced as she processed the implications. If Kaelis truly hungered, then it wasn't merely observing them. It was interacting with them. Intelligent, purposeful, dangerous. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. Fear would not serve her now. Humanity had faced countless threats throughout its history, and each time they had adapted, survived, thrived. This would be no different. "Captain," Dr. Idris Khan called out from his station, his voice tinged with both awe and unease. "I've cross-referenced the language patterns in the transmission. They match fragments we've recovered from ancient alien ruins. This isn't random. Whoever or whatever created this moon intended for us to understand." "Understand what?" Elara snapped, her patience fraying under the strain of the situation. "That it wants to eat us." Idris hesitated, his fingers hovering over his console. "Not necessarily eat per se, more like consume. Energy, life force, resources. Think of it less as a predator and more as a parasite. Or perhaps even a machine, a self-sustaining entity designed to harvest what it needs to survive." "A machine," Rhea interjected sharply, her skepticism evident. "You're telling me this thing is some kind of cosmic vacuum cleaner? That doesn't explain why it's dragging us closer or why our systems are failing." "It's not just a machine," Idris countered, his tone firm despite the chaos around him. "It's alive. Sentient, maybe not in the way we think of life, but it's aware. It knows we're here, and it's responding to our presence." Elara turned back to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the crimson orb that loomed ever larger. The moon seemed to pulse now, its glow intensifying with each passing moment. It was as if it were breathing, inhaling deeply, drawing strength from their fear. Her stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to push past it. Understanding was key. Survival depended on it. "Assume it's sentient," she said finally, addressing the bridge crew. "What do we know about how it operates?" What does it want? Idris hesitated again, clearly reluctant to speculate further. But when he spoke, his words carried a grim certainty. Based on the energy signatures we're detecting, I'd say it feeds off reactor cores. Nuclear fusion, plasma emissions, anything capable of generating large amounts of power. That's why our ships are destabilizing. It's siphoning energy directly from our systems. And the people? Elara pressed, her voice low but urgent. What happens to them? Idris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at his datapad, his expression darkening. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill through the room. Historical records mention something called the Red Veil. Survivors of encounters with Kaelis describe visions, ghosts, apparitions, memories of those who came before. Some say the moon doesn't just consume energy, it absorbs consciousness too. Memories, souls. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person on the bridge knew what that meant. Those who fell victim to Kaelis didn't simply die. They were erased, consumed entirely, leaving nothing behind but echoes of their existence. Elara swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed. There was no time for despair, not yet. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We need options. Fast. How do we stop it?" Rhea stepped forward, her jaw set in determination. "We hit it. Hard. Everything we've got: torpedoes, railguns, EMP bursts. If it's feeding off our reactors, maybe we can overload its systems and fry it from the inside out, and risk destroying ourselves in the process." Elara shot back, her tone sharp. "If we fire everything we have and miss, we're dead. All of us. Better than sitting here waiting to be eaten," Rhea retorted, her frustration boiling over. "You wanted options, Captain. That's one." Elara glared at her second-in-command, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. She knew Rhea was right, at least in part. Aggression might buy them time, but it wouldn't solve the problem, not completely. They needed more than brute force. They needed understanding. Before she could respond, another alarm blared, louder and more insistent this time. One of the officers shouted, "Ship integrity failing. Hull breaches detected on multiple vessels." Elara's heart sank as she turned back to the viewport. Outside, the fleet was beginning to break apart. Smaller ships were already succumbing to the moon's pull, their hulls buckling under the strain. Escape pods launched in desperation, streaking away like fireflies into the void. But it wasn't enough. The moon was relentless, pulling harder with every passing second. "We can't outrun it," Elara muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "And we can't fight it head-on, so what's left?" Her thoughts turned inward, searching for answers amidst the chaos. Humanity had always prided itself on its ingenuity, its ability to adapt and overcome. Surely there was a way to turn this situation to their advantage, to use their strengths against Kaelis' weaknesses. Then it hit her. "Idris," she said, suddenly, her voice cutting through the noise. "You said it feeds off energy, right? What if we gave it exactly what it wanted?" The doctor blinked, startled by the question. "You mean, feed it?" "Yes," Elara replied, her mind racing. "But not just any energy. We overload one of our reactors, channel the explosion directly into the moon. If we time it right, we might be able to disrupt its systems long enough to break free." Rhea frowned, clearly skeptical. "And what happens to the ship carrying the reactor? Assuming it works, whoever stays behind to trigger the overload won't make it out alive." "I'll do it," Elara said without hesitation. Her decision was met with stunned silence. Even Rhea looked taken aback, though whether from shock or admiration was impossible to tell. "No," Rhea said finally, stepping closer. "You're the captain. You can't—" "I'm also responsible for these people," Elara interrupted, her voice firm. "If sacrificing myself gives them a chance to survive, then that's what I'll do. End of discussion." For a moment it seemed like Rhea might argue further, but instead she nodded curtly, her expression unreadable. "Understood. I'll coordinate the evacuation efforts. Make sure everyone else gets clear before you proceed." Elara offered a small, grateful nod before turning her attention back to the task at hand. Time was running out, and there was still much to do. But as she prepared to enact her plan, a strange sensation washed over her. A mix of dread and resolve, fear and hope. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Humanity's fate rested in her hands. Outside the viewport, the crimson moon pulsed brighter, almost expectant. It knew something was coming. Whether it understood the full scope of Elara's plan remained to be seen. But one way or another, the blood moon was about to get exactly what it demanded. The decision hung heavy in the air, a silent spectre that loomed over every action taken on the bridge. Elara's plan was risky, reckless even, but it was there. Only chance. The crew moved with mechanical precision, their faces pale but resolute as they prepared for what lay ahead. Orders were barked, systems rerouted, and reactors primed for overload. Each second stretched like an eternity, the weight of impending doom pressing down on them all. As the evacuation protocols began, Lieutenant Neve Quinn approached Elara, her young face etched with determination, despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of activity, "you don't have to do this alone." Elara turned to her, surprised by the offer. Neve had always been quiet, almost invisible among the senior officers. But now, standing there with her fists clenched and her jaw set, she looked every bit the warrior humanity needed her to be. "I appreciate the sentiment, Lieutenant," Elara replied, her tone softening just slightly. "But someone has to stay behind to trigger the sequence, and that someone is me." Niav shook her head, her expression unwavering. "You're not thinking strategically. If you die here, who will lead the survivors? Who will make sure they understand what happened? You're more valuable alive than dead." Elara opened her mouth to argue, but Niav cut her off before she could speak. "Let me help. I can monitor the reactor from engineering while you coordinate the fleet's retreat. Together we might actually pull this off." For a moment, Elara considered refusing. It wasn't fair to ask anyone else to share in her sacrifice. But deep down, she knew Neve was right. This wasn't just about survival. It was about ensuring humanity learned from this encounter, about making sure no one else fell victim to Kaelis' hunger. "All right," Elara said finally, her voice firm but tinged with gratitude. "But if things go south, you get out of there. Understood?" Neve nodded, though her expression suggested she had no intention of leaving until the job was done. Meanwhile, Rhea Solis worked tirelessly to oversee the evacuation efforts, her sharp features illuminated by the glow of her datapad. She moved between stations, issuing commands and checking progress, her demeanor cold and calculating. To the untrained eye, she appeared focused solely on the task at hand. But beneath her composed exterior, doubt gnawed at her resolve. She couldn't shake the feeling that Elara's plan was doomed to fail. Sacrificing ships, even lives, to save the rest felt wrong, unnatural. Humanity wasn't meant to bow to cosmic forces. They were meant to conquer them. And yet, here they were, reduced to bargaining chips in some ancient alien game. Her thoughts turned darker as she watched escape pods launch into the void, carrying frightened civilians and junior crew members to safety. Was this really the best they could do? Surrender themselves to the whims of a bloodthirsty moon? Or was there another way, a better way? Before she could dwell further on the matter, a sudden jolt rocked the ship, throwing several crew members off balance. Alarms blared once more, louder and more urgent than before. One of the officers shouted, "Reactor instability detected. Hull integrity failing." Rhea's heart raced as she rushed to the nearest console, her fingers flying over the controls. The readings confirmed her worst fears. The moon's gravitational pull was accelerating, dragging the fleet closer with each passing second. Ships that hadn't already succumbed were beginning to break apart, their hulls buckling under the strain. "We're losing them," someone cried, panic creeping into their voice. Rhea clenched her teeth, her mind racing. There had to be another option, another solution, something beyond Elara's reckless gamble, and then it hit her. "Divert all remaining power to the forward shields," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Prepare to fire everything we've got at the moon, torpedoes, railguns, EMP bursts. We hit it now before it consumes us completely." The crew hesitated, unsure whether to follow her orders or stick to Elara's plan. Rhea didn't wait for their approval. She took control of the weapon systems herself, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Within moments, the fleet's remaining armaments were locked onto Kaelis, ready to unleash hell. Back on the Eos Dawn, Elara felt the shift in energy immediately. The ship shuddered violently as power surged through its systems, redirecting resources away from life support and toward the weapons array. Her stomach churned as she realized what was happening. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, turning to find Rhea standing nearby, her expression defiant. "I'm taking command," Rhea replied coolly. "Your plan isn't working." "Captain, we need to fight back." Elara stared at her, disbelief warring with anger. "You're risking everyone's lives. Do you even know what you're doing?" "I'm saving them," Rhea shot back, her voice sharp. "If we sit here waiting to be consumed, we're as good as dead anyway. At least this way we stand a chance." Before Elara could respond, the first salvo fired, streaking toward the crimson moon like streaks of lightning against the blackness of space. For a brief moment, hope flared within the crew. Their weapons struck true, impacting the moon's surface with explosive force. But instead of weakening it, the attack seemed to fuel its hunger. Its glow intensified, pulsing brighter and faster, as though it were laughing at their feeble attempts to harm it. "No," Elara whispered, her voice trembling. "It's feeding off the energy." Her words were drowned out by another alarm, this one deeper and more guttural than the last. The ship lurched violently, throwing everyone to the ground. Outside the viewport, the moon loomed larger than ever, its crimson light casting an eerie shadow over the fleet. "We're too late," Rhea muttered, her confidence crumbling under the weight of failure. "It's pulling us in." Elara scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. They were running out of time and options. Desperation clawed at her chest as she turned to Neve, who stood nearby, her face pale but determined. "Status on the reactor?" Elara asked, her voice tight with urgency. "Almost ready," Neve replied, her hands moving frantically over the console. 30 seconds until critical mass." Elara nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. As the countdown ticked down, the tension aboard the Eos Dawn reached a fever pitch. Crew members braced themselves, clinging to consoles and railings as the ship groaned under the strain of the moon's pull. Outside, the fleet continued to disintegrate, ship after ship succumbing to Kaelis's insatiable hunger. Escape pods streaked into the void, carrying the last remnants of humanity's hope. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected occurred. As the reactor neared critical mass, the moon's glow shifted, changing from crimson to a deep, pulsating blue. The gravitational pull lessened slightly, giving the fleet a fleeting reprieve. "What's happening?" Neve asked, her voice tinged with awe. Elara stared at the viewport, her heart pounding. "It's reacting to the energy buildup. Maybe it's trying to communicate." The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. Kaelis wasn't just a mindless predator. It was intelligent, capable of responding to stimuli. Perhaps it didn't want to destroy them outright. Perhaps it simply wanted to survive. "Hold the overload," Elara commanded, her voice cutting. through the noise. Give me a direct line to the moon's transmission frequency. Neve hesitated, clearly confused by the order. Are you sure? If we stop now... Trust me, Elara interrupted, her tone leaving no room for argument. With trembling hands, Neve adjusted the comm system, broadcasting a single message into the void. We are not your enemy. We seek understanding. For a moment, nothing happened. Then slowly the moon's glow dimmed, its pulsations slowing to a steady rhythm. A new transmission appeared on the main display, written in the same alien script as before. This time, however, the AI translated it instantly. The blood moon listens. Elara exhaled sharply, her body sagging with relief. Against all odds, they had found a way to connect, but the victory was short-lived. Behind her, Rhea stepped forward, her expression dark with betrayal. "You think talking will save us?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "This thing doesn't care about understanding. It cares about consuming. And when it's done with us, it'll move on to the next target." Before Elara could respond, Rhea drew her sidearm, aiming it squarely at her. "I won't let you gamble with our lives any longer. Stand down, or I'll take command by force." The bridge fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. For a moment it seemed like time itself had frozen. Then, without warning, Neve lunged forward, tackling Rhea to the ground. The two women struggled briefly before Neve managed to disarm her, pinning her to the floor. "It's over, Commander," Neve said firmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're not doing this your way anymore." Rhea glared up at her, hatred burning in her eyes, but she didn't resist. Instead, she went limp, her expression unreadable. Elara watched the exchange with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Betrayal stung deeply, especially when it came from someone she trusted. But there was no time to dwell on it. The reactor was still, primed for overload, and the moon's patience was wearing thin. "Resume the countdown," she ordered, her voice firm. 10 seconds. Let's finish this." As the final moments ticked away, Elara turned back to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the glowing orb that loomed before them. Whatever happened next, humanity would endure, because that was what they did. That was who they were. And as the reactor reached critical mass, the blood moon pulsed one final time, its crimson light fading into darkness. The reactor's countdown reached its final seconds, each tick reverberating through the Eos Dawn like a heartbeat racing toward its last. Elara stood on the bridge, her hands gripping the railing as she stared at the viewport. Outside, Kaelis pulsed faintly, its crimson glow dimming to a deep, ominous blue. The moon seemed almost expectant, as if it understood what was coming and had accepted its fate. But acceptance wasn't the same as submission, and Elara couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with forces far beyond their comprehension. 5 seconds, Neve called out from engineering, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. Her fingers hovered over the console, ready to trigger the overload sequence at Elara's command. Elara closed her eyes for a brief moment, steeling herself against the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a gamble, a desperate bid to save humanity. By feeding the very thing that sought to destroy them. If it worked, they might live to tell the tale. If it didn't, well, there wouldn't be anyone left to mourn their failure. 4. She glanced back at the crew, their faces pale but resolute. Some clung to consoles or railings, bracing themselves for the inevitable. Others simply stood frozen, staring into the void outside the viewport. They trusted her to see this through, to make the right call. But was it the right call, or was she leading them all to their doom? 3. Her thoughts turned inward, searching for clarity amidst the storm. Humanity had always prided itself on its ingenuity, its ability to adapt and overcome. But here, in the shadow of an ancient alien entity, those traits felt small, insignificant. What good was ingenuity when faced with something so vast, so incomprehensible? What good was resilience when survival came at such a cost? And yet even now, even here, humanity refused to yield, refused to bow. That stubbornness, that refusal to give up no matter how dire the odds, that was what made them who they were. It was both their greatest strength and their most dangerous flaw, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was also their salvation. 1. Elara opened her eyes, her gaze locking onto the glowing orb that loomed before them. "Do it," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Neef hesitated for the briefest of moments, then pressed the final command. The ship shuddered violently as the reactor surged, energy coursing through its systems like blood rushing through veins. Alarms blared, red warning lights flashing across the bridge. The countdown reached 0, and the world exploded. For a split second, everything went silent. The hum of machinery, the groan of metal under strain, the panicked shouts of the crew, all of it vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then, with a deafening roar, the reactor detonated, unleashing a torrent of energy that tore through the ship and hurtled toward Kaelis. The moon absorbed the blast greedily, its surface rippling like liquid fire. For a moment, it seemed to swell, growing larger and brighter until it filled the entire viewport. Its glow shifted rapidly, cycling through colors too vivid, too unnatural to describe. Crimson gave way to gold, then green, then violet, each hue more intense than the last. It was beautiful and terrifying. Elara shielded her eyes, the light searing into her retinas despite the tinted glass of the viewport. She could feel the heat radiating off the moon, burning her skin even from miles away. The ship groaned again, its hull buckling under the strain. Escape pods launched in desperation, streaking into the void like sparks from a dying flame. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The moon's glow dimmed, returning to its original crimson hue, but softer now, almost gentle. The gravitational pull lessened, releasing the fleet from its grip. Ships that had been moments away from destruction stabilized, their systems rebooting. As power returned, "It worked," Neef whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the moon, her mind racing. Had they truly pacified it, or merely delayed the inevitable? Whatever the case, one thing was certain: they weren't out of danger yet. Before she could speak, another transmission appeared on the main display. Unlike the previous messages, this one wasn't delivered in the toneless mechanical voice of the AI. Instead, it came directly from Kaelis, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the ship like a living thing. "You have sated my hunger." The voice intoned, its words slow and deliberate. "For now." Elara's heart skipped a beat. Sated, but not satisfied. The implication was clear: this wasn't over, not completely. "What do you want?" she asked aloud, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Why are you doing this?" The response came slowly, each word heavy with meaning. "I'm a relic of those who came before, created to sustain, to endure, to consume. Your kind seeks answers where none exist. You ask why, but there is no why. Only hunger, only survival." Elara clenched her fists, frustration bubbling beneath. "The surface. There has to be more to it than that. You're intelligent. You must understand what you're doing. How many lives you've destroyed." Another pause, longer this time. When the voice spoke again, it carried a note of sadness, or perhaps regret. "Intelligence does not equate to morality. I am what I am, neither ally nor enemy, merely existence." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Elara wanted to argue, to demand further explanation, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't change anything. Kaelis wasn't human. It didn't think or feel the way they did. To it, humanity was little more than fuel, a means to an end. "We'll leave you be," she said finally, her voice firm despite the turmoil within. "But know this, if you ever threaten us again, we won't hesitate to fight back." The moon pulsed once, its glow shifting briefly to a soft blue. Whether it was acknowledgement or dismissal, Elara couldn't tell, but the message was clear. Their encounter was over, for now. As the fleet regrouped, the survivors took stock of the damage. Half the ships had been lost, their crews either dead or stranded in escape pods drifting aimlessly through space. Those who remained were battered and broken, their spirits crushed by the horrors they'd witnessed. Yet amidst the devastation, there was a glimmer of hope. They had survived. Against all odds, they had endured. Elara stood on the bridge of the Eos Dawn, watching as the remaining ships formed up around her. Her body ached, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay upright, to project strength even when she felt none. The crew needed her, not just as their captain, but as a symbol of resilience, of defiance. Behind her, Rhea Solis approached, her expression unreadable. After being disarmed and detained during the confrontation, she had been released under guard, her role in the mutiny forgiven, if not forgotten. Now standing before Elara, she looked every bit the defeated woman she claimed not to be. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharpness. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Elara studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. "Intentions don't matter," she replied finally, "only actions, and yours nearly cost us everything." Rhea nodded, accepting the rebuke without argument. "What happens now?" Elara turned back to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the crimson moon that loomed in the distance. "We go home," she said simply, "and we prepare. Because if Kaelis isn't alone, if there are others like it out there, then humanity needs to be ready." Hours later, as the fleet limped toward the nearest jump point, Elara found herself reflecting on the events that had transpired. She had made a choice, a difficult, morally complex decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it had been necessary. Survival always came at a cost. The question was whether that cost was worth paying. Her thoughts turned to Neve, who had proven herself invaluable during the crisis. Young, inexperienced, and yet fiercely loyal, she represented the best of humanity, adaptable, resilient, unyielding. Perhaps it was fitting that she had played such a crucial role in their survival. "You should get some rest," Neve said softly, interrupting Elara's musings. "You've earned it." Elara managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "So have you," she replied. "But first, we need to make sure everyone else is okay. Check on the injured, account for the missing. We can't afford to lose anyone else." Neve nodded, her expression grim but determined. "Understood. I'll start organizing search and rescue operations." As she turned to leave, Elara called after her. "Neve!" The lieutenant paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Yes, Captain?" "Thank you," Elara said simply, "for everything." Nim hesitated, then offered a small, grateful nod before disappearing down the corridor. Alone once more, Elara turned back to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. Humanity had faced countless threats throughout its history, and each time they had adapted, survived, thrived. This encounter with Kaelis was no different. It was a reminder of their fragility and their strength, of their capacity for ingenuity, trust, betrayal, and redemption. Out there, in the vast expanse of space, lay untold mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Ancient relics, alien civilizations, cosmic phenomena, all of it beckoning humanity to explore, to discover, to endure. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with peril, one thing was certain: humanity would keep moving forward. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. And as the fleet disappeared into the void, leaving the blood moon behind, Elara allowed herself a single fleeting moment of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as humans always had, with resilience, with determination, with hope. Because humanity didn't just survive, it thrived. The journey back to human space was a somber one. The survivors of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet drifted through the void like ghosts, their ships battered and scarred from the encounter with Kaelis. Each vessel carried its share of wounded, grieving, and traumatized souls. Some spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen, the crimson glow of the moon, the ghostly apparitions that haunted their dreams, the sheer terror of knowing they were being consumed. Others remained silent, their faces pale and drawn, as if trying to forget. Elara Voss stood on the bridge of the Eos Dawn, her hands resting lightly on the railing as she stared out at the endless expanse of stars. The adrenaline that had fueled her during the crisis had long since faded, leaving behind an aching exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. She felt hollow, as though part of her had been left behind on that cursed moon. Yet even now, even here, she couldn't afford to let herself break. Not yet. There were still lives depending on her. "Captain," Lieutenant Neve Quinn said, softly, approaching with a datapad in hand. "Casualty reports are in." Elara turned to face her, bracing herself for the worst. "How bad is it?" Neve hesitated, her expression grim. "We lost nearly half the fleet, over 3,000. Crew members dead or missing, another 2,000 injured. Most of the escape pods haven't been recovered yet. We're still searching, but—" Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Elara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the numbers. 3,000 lives. Gone. In the blink of an eye, erased by the hunger of an ancient alien entity. It wasn't just a loss. It was a tragedy, a failure. And while she knew logically that there had been no other choice, the guilt gnawed at her nonetheless. "Keep looking," she said finally, her voice firm despite the turmoil within. "Every pod, every survivor. We don't leave anyone behind." "Yes, Captain," Neve replied, offering a small, grateful nod before turning to relay the orders. As she walked away, Elara turned back to the viewport, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. They were beautiful, serene, even comforting in their constancy. But tonight they offered little solace. Humanity had ventured into the unknown seeking answers, only to find themselves faced with questions far greater than they had anticipated. What did it mean to survive, to endure, to thrive? Was it worth the cost? Her thoughts turned inward, reflecting on the choices she had made. Sacrificing ships, risking lives, trusting in the unknown. All of it had been necessary. But necessity didn't make it right, and deep down she wondered if history would remember her as a hero or a fool, perhaps both. Days passed, and the fleet limped closer to human space. News of their survival spread quickly, carried by automated distress signals sent ahead of their arrival. By the time they reached the nearest colony, a delegation awaited. Them, scientists, diplomats, military officials, all eager to hear their story, to understand what had happened, to learn from their mistakes. Elara addressed them personally, standing before a crowded auditorium filled with anxious faces. Her uniform was clean but worn, her posture rigid, despite the fatigue etched into her features. She recounted the events of their mission in stark detail, sparing no one the horrors they had faced. When she described the moment the reactor detonated, feeding Kaelis's insatiable hunger, the room fell silent, a collective shiver running through the audience. "But we survived," she concluded, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. And we learned something important. Kaelis isn't just a threat, it's a warning, a reminder of how small we are in the grand scheme of things, of how much we still have to learn. The crowd murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging skeptical glances. One scientist raised his hand, his expression thoughtful. "Do you believe it can be reasoned with, communicated with?" Elara hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's intelligent, yes, but not in the way we think of intelligence. It doesn't care about morality or ethics, only survival. Whether it can be reasoned with remains to be seen. But I do believe it's possible to coexist if we approach it with caution and respect." The answer seemed to satisfy most of the audience, though a few remained unconvinced. As the Q&A session continued, Elara fielded question after question, her patience wearing thin but her resolve unwavering. Humanity needed answers, and she owed it to them to provide what she could. When the meeting finally ended, she retreated to her quarters, collapsing onto the edge of her bunk with a heavy sigh. Her body ached, her mind reeling from the emotional toll of reliving the mission over and over again. Yet even now, even here, she couldn't allow herself to rest. Not completely. There was still work to be done. That evening, Neve joined her, carrying a tray of food and a bottle of wine pilfered from the colony's supplies. "Thought you might need this," she said with a small smile, setting the tray down on the desk. Elara chuckled softly, shaking her head. "You're going to get us both court-martialed." "Worth it," Neve replied, pouring 2 glasses and handing one to Elara. "Besides, you deserve it. After everything you've done." Elara accepted the glass, taking a slow sip as she studied the younger woman. Neve had grown so much over the course of the mission, from a quiet, unassuming pilot to a confident, capable leader. She represented the future of humanity, resilient, adaptable, unyielding. And perhaps in some small way, she also represented redemption, for Elara, for the fleet, for everyone who had survived. "You've earned this too," Elara said finally, raising her glass in a silent toast. "To surviving." Neve smiled, clinking her glass against Elara's. "To surviving and thriving." They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping their wine and watching the stars through the viewport. For the first time in days, Elara allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Humanity had faced countless challenges throughout its history, and each time they had adapted, survived, thrived. This encounter with Kaelis was no different. It was a reminder of their fragility and their strength, of their capacity for ingenuity, trust, betrayal, and redemption. Out there, in the vast expanse of space, lay untold mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Ancient relics, alien civilizations, cosmic phenomena, all of it beckoning humanity to explore, to discover, to endure. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with peril, one thing was certain: humanity would keep moving forward. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. And as the stars shimmered outside the viewport, casting their cold light into the room, Elara allowed herself a single fleeting moment of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as humans always had, with resilience, with determination, with hope. Because humanity didn't just survive, it thrived. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, or at least as close to normalcy as it could for those who had survived the encounter with Kaelis. The fleet's return had sparked widespread debate across human space. Some hailed Elara Voss as a hero, crediting her ingenuity and sacrifice with saving what remained of the 7th Expeditionary Fleet. Others questioned her decisions, arguing that feeding an ancient alien entity, even one as incomprehensible as Kaelis, was reckless and dangerous. Could humanity afford to negotiate with forces they didn't fully understand? Or was this merely a temporary reprieve before the next disaster? Elara herself avoided the spotlight as much as possible, retreating to a quiet corner of the colony where she could reflect in solitude. She spent her days poring over data collected during the mission, searching for answers that might help humanity prepare for whatever lay ahead. But no matter how many reports she read or simulations she ran, one question lingered in her mind, gnawing at her like a splinter she couldn't remove. Had they truly pacified Kaelis, or simply delayed its hunger? One evening, Neve Quinn found Elara standing on the observation deck, staring out at the stars. The younger woman approached cautiously, sensing the weight of her mentor's thoughts without needing to ask. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" she said softly. Elara didn't turn to face her immediately. Instead, she took a slow sip from the glass of wine in her hand, letting the silence stretch between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "How can I not? We gave it everything we had, and it let us go, for now. But what happens when it gets hungry again?" Neve hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was, she didn't have an answer. None of them did. All they knew for certain was that Kaelis wasn't gone. It was merely dormant, waiting, and waiting was often worse than knowing. Before either of them could say more, a faint red flicker caught their attention. At first, it seemed like nothing, a trick of the light perhaps, or a reflection from somewhere nearby. But as they watched, the flicker grew brighter, pulsing rhythmically against the blackness of space. It wasn't coming from any known star or celestial body. It was something else entirely. "What is that?" Niam whispered, her voice tinged with awe and unease. Elara's heart raced as she studied the phenomenon, her instincts screaming that this wasn't coincidence. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the comms device on her belt. "Bridge, this is Captain Voss. Do you see that signal on your scanners?" There was a pause before the reply came, crackling slightly over the line. "Affirmative, Captain. Unknown origin. It's repeating. Same pattern as before." Elara's stomach churned. The same pattern, the same transmission. "Patch it!" "Through!" she ordered, her voice tight with urgency. Seconds later, the message appeared on the nearest display, written in the same alien script they had encountered months ago. This time, however, the AI translated it instantly. "The blood." Moon remembers. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Remembered what? Their sacrifice? Their defiance? Or something else entirely? Whatever the case, the implications were clear. Kaelis hadn't forgotten them, and neither had it forgiven. "Captain," Neve began, her voice trembling slightly. "What does it mean?" Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the pulsing red light, her mind racing. Humanity had faced countless threats throughout its history, and each time they had adapted, survived, thrived. But this was different. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a reckoning, a test of their resilience, their ingenuity, their morality, and, deep down, she knew they weren't ready. "We need to be prepared," she said finally, her voice firm despite the turmoil within. "Whatever happens next, we can't face it unprepared." Neve nodded, though her expression remained grim. "Do you think it's coming back?" Elara turned to her, her gaze unwavering. "I don't know, but if it is, we'll be ready." As they stood there watching the red light pulse in the distance, a single thought echoed in both their minds. Survival wasn't enough. Humanity had to adapt, to grow, to evolve. Because out there, in the vast expanse of space, untold mysteries awaited them. Ancient relics, alien civilizations, cosmic phenomena, all of it beckoning them to explore, to discover, to endure. But exploration came at a cost, and humanity would have to decide whether that cost was worth paying. Later that night, as Elara lay awake in her quarters, she replayed the events of the past months in her mind. They had survived, thrived even, but at what cost? How many lives had been lost? How many sacrifices made? And for what? A temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of peace? Her thoughts turned to the future, to the challenges that lay ahead. Humanity had always prided itself on its ability to adapt, to overcome. But adaptation required understanding. Understanding required trust. And trust, well, trust was a fragile thing. As she drifted off to sleep, one final thought lingered, in her mind echoing like a distant star. If humanity fed the monsters to survive, did they become monsters themselves?